This is why they don't want you to watch until the end, and you're about to understand why. The empire Alexander built was not just territory on a map, it was a machine that still depended on one heartbeat. And the closer his life moved toward its end, the clearer one truth became: conquest was finished faster than governance could be made permanent. In Babylon, behind locked doors, his senior men gathered around a silent diagram of councils, provinces, and chains of command, structures meant to outlive a single ruler. The plan was there in principle, but the final signatures, the final rules, the final acceptance had not yet hardened into law. By the river, shipwrights stood over half-framed hulls while officers studied routines for crews. Pay and discipline. Alexander's vision was not merely fleets, it was a navy that could function automatically, even when the king was not present to command it. In a granary hall, inspectors weighed sacks and sealed amphorae as if food were the empire's true currency. Alexander understood that armies and cities starved the same way, and he tried to turn supply into audited habit instead of emergency seizure. In another chamber, nobles from different worlds stood facing one another, marriages, appointments, and alliances arranged like fragile bridges. He pushed integration not as a gesture, but as a method to keep rivals from becoming separate nations inside one empire. Far from the capital, watchtowers and unfinished fortifications marked the edge of authority. The question was never whether Alexander could take new ground, but whether garrisons could remain loyal once his personal gravity disappeared. In a planning room of instruments, compasses, measuring rods, specimen jars, scholars and officers prepared surveys of coasts and routes. Knowledge, in Alexander's mind, was supposed to become administration, maps that fed policies, not trophies for curiosity. Architects laid out a monumental funerary design as if building memory into stone could stabilize succession. Yet the tomb itself hinted at a danger. Even a body could become a political weapon if the future was not settled in law. In a standards chamber, weights and measures were aligned like a promise of fairness. Alexander began the work of economic unity. But unity requires enforcement, and enforcement requires a system that cannot be argued away by whoever holds the nearest sword. In an education room, young heirs and hostages learned under guarded silence. The goal was clear: train tomorrow's administrators to belong to one center, so that loyalty becomes career and habit, not fear and bargaining. In an office of city templates, models of gates and courtyards sat beside a network of planned foundations. Alexander's cities were meant to be anchors, repeatable structures of control and culture, yet anchors fail when every successor tries to claim them as personal prizes. In a ritual scheduling hall, priests and officials arranged calendars and offerings to blend legitimacy across cultures. Alexander knew symbols could pacify where force would only inflame, if the symbols were protected by consistent policy. In an archive workshop, scribes prepared copying routines and distribution routes, trying to make decrees and records impossible to erase. But when authority fractures, archives become spoil, paper and clay become battlefields. Engineers studied canal models and port basins, planning to fuse inland movement with maritime power. Infrastructure was supposed to make distance smaller, so that provinces could not drift into private kingdoms behind geography. In an arbitration hall, veterans and locals waited while survey cords and boundary stones lay ready. Land, law, and settlement were the only way to turn conquest into peace, yet peace collapses when courts cannot enforce rights beyond the capital's shadow. In an intelligence briefing room, western coastlines and port dots were traced without names, just possibilities. Alexander still looked outward, but every outward plan depended on inward stability, the one project he could not rush. In a diplomatic chamber, gifts and sealed packets waited like unopened futures. Treaties could replace bloodshed, but only if agreements were enforced by institutions rather than by the personality of the man who negotiated them. And everywhere, granaries, shipyards, courts, roads, blank ledgers waited to be filled the same way. Every season, every year, that was the unfinished core of Alexander's dream, not the next conquest, but the routines that would keep the empire alive when he was gone. The last line of every plan led back to the same question: when the king's voice is gone, who speaks for the system? In Babylon's inner rooms, the air felt heavy with that question, because everyone understood that paper and seals are only powerful when the world agrees they are. In a guarded medical chamber, Physicians and attendants surrounded Alexander's bed with bowls, linens, and jars, as if order could be maintained by arranging objects neatly. Yet the truth lay in the stillness. Illness turned the empire into a waiting room, and every official decision began to hesitate. Nearby, a regency council gathered around plain signet rings, sealed packets, and blank ledgers, their posture careful, their spacing tense. A diadem under cloth and a shadowed cradle suggested a future that was not ready. And the missing certainty made even loyal men start calculating. Along a palace corridor lined with locked doors, an iron-banded chest and small table held sealed clay and unmarked rings like weapons. Courtiers and commanders watched those objects, because whoever controlled the seal controlled the illusion of continuity. Outside the city, on a dusty pay ground, soldiers stood in disciplined ranks facing chests, scales, and rosters. Alexander had once made loyalty feel personal. Now loyalty became arithmetic, coin, rations, and promises measured out by whoever dared to claim authority. In a provincial mint, officials handled tribute of mismatched sizes and weights, exposing how quickly local systems could return when the center weakened. Reform was not a decree. Reform was years of inspection, penalties, and routine, time Alexander no longer had. Far away, in a satrapal hall, a local noble and a Macedonian overseer stood across a table like two governments sharing the same room. A messenger waited with sealed packets that might never be answered, and autonomy grew inside that silence. In a Greek civic courtyard, citizens clustered in tense groups around an unnamed coastline map, calculating what freedom might look like if the imperial hand loosened. Rebellion did not need chaos, it needed doubt. And doubt was spreading. Back in the west, in a Macedonian audience chamber, a covered diadem and unmarked signet ring sat like a test. Courtiers watched one another more than the throne, because legitimacy without a final settlement becomes a contest of proximity. At the far frontier, garrisons stood by watchtowers and dry plains, staring at pay chests and waiting for orders. Distance became a threat, because an empire is only one empire when salaries arrive and commands are unquestioned. In shipyards, unfinished hull frames waited under idle cranes, and clerks held sealed packets over blank ledgers as if administration could be paused like construction. Without continuity, shipyards became prizes, not institutions. In libraries and catalogue rooms, shelves of scroll cases and tablets stood like a captured treasure. Knowledge could have been an empire's memory, but without protection and routine distribution, memory becomes loot for the strongest hand. In diplomatic halls, envoys faced empty chairs and guarded doors, their gifts arranged for treaties that required one signature to become law. Without that signature, diplomacy turned back into bargaining, and bargaining turned back into threat. In veterans' courtyards, half-built walls and stacked timber hinted at promises not yet fulfilled. Demobilization required steady law and steady supply, but steady things vanish quickly when a center is contested. At border forts, officers studied maps of passes and watchtowers beside sealed supply crates, trying to make permanence out of routine. Yet permanence is not built with plans alone, it is built with repetition. And repetition needs time. In provincial tax halls, merchants and farmers waited before scales, weights, and ledgers, sensing that rules could change overnight. When legitimacy is uncertain, compliance becomes negotiable, and negotiable compliance becomes instability. Even in rooms of philosophy and policy, where scrolls lay beside helmets and spears, the same lesson echoed: vision is not a structure is what remains when the visionary is gone. And so the empire's greatest unfinished project revealed itself in every silent ledger and unopened packet. Alexander had not completed the transfer from personal command to self-sustaining institution. And the moment his breath weakened, every rival began to hear opportunity. In the great treasuries, the first danger was not theft but interpretation. When one ruler holds the meaning of every seal, every successor tries to become the meaning maker, and even honest officials start choosing sides. In Susa, finance officers stood over scales and calibrated containers as if precision could protect the state. Yet the most important measurement was invisible: how much trust still existed between provinces and the center. In Tyre, envoys arranged gifts and sealed bundles beside a bare map of ports and sea routes. Alexander's treaties were meant to become routine law, but now every agreement felt temporary. waiting to be renegotiated by whoever controlled the nearest ships. Back in Babylon, court archives filled with unmarked bundles and sealed cases, and judges debated procedure beneath an appeals diagram that was still only a diagram. Without a stable authority to enforce precedent, the law risked becoming another battlefield. On a construction terrace, engineers stared at a model of canals, warehouses, and harbor basins. The work was meant to bind inland grain to maritime power, but infrastructure dies quietly when funding becomes contested and labor drafts are no longer honored. At the River Dock Pavilion, officers studied plans for port stations and naval rules. Alexander had envisioned audited schedules, patrol rotations, and stable staffing, yet every plan depended on an unbroken chain of authority that was now cracking. In the road relay headquarters, sealed packets sat in strict rows, and couriers waited with satchels and spare cloaks. The relay system could have made distance predictable, but predictability collapses when punishment and reward stop being consistent. On an observatory terrace, scholars gathered around instruments and seasonal diagrams, knowing that timekeeping is governance. A shared calendar could unify planting, tax collection, and provisioning, but unification requires enforcement beyond one city. In the Translation Bureau, scribes prepared standardized formats for decrees and reports, trying to make policy understandable across languages. Yet even perfect translation cannot save a decree that no longer carries unquestioned authority. In settlement offices, administrators weighed land grants and ration promises against the reality of scarce materials. Veterans could become citizens, but only if property rights were protected, disputes were settled, and supplies arrived on schedule. At border forts, rotation and pay schedules were supposed to turn garrisons into loyal institutions. Not private factions, but when the center hesitates, every commander learns how quickly soldiers follow coin instead of law. In integration halls, Macedonian companions and Persian nobles faced one another in careful lines, the space between them filled with fear of betrayal. Fusion required consistent protections over years, not a single royal gesture. In tax offices, citizens watched scales and seal stones with suspicion. Record-based governance could replace coercion, yet coercion returns the moment audits weaken and exemptions become favors sold to allies. Across the empire's fractured map, the same pattern repeated. Systems that required repetition began to stall. And when a system stalls, a rival steps into the gap and calls it necessity. In the final panorama of administration, an empty chair faced an empire drawn as dots and lines. The roads, ports, granaries, courts, and garrisons were still there, but without an accepted center. They were just pieces. Alexander had conquered faster than he could finish the one task that decides whether conquest lasts, building routines that run on law, not on personality. And now, as the empire held its breath, his unfinished work began to unravel into inheritance. In the planning chambers of Alexandria in Egypt, the sea breeze drifted through open arches where scholars and administrators stood over river deltas and harbor silhouettes. Alexander's encouragement of learning was meant to become something stronger than patronage, a protected, standardized archive that could outlast any single reign. But an archive without secure authority becomes a prize, not a pillar. Back in Babylon's shipyards, timber and rope sat in disciplined stacks beneath idle cranes. Officers held pay schedules and provisioning rules as if documents alone could command men. Yet a navy is not built by hulls, it is built by routines that survive leadership changes. And those routines were still fragile. In veterans' tents near the city, worn shields and travel packs lay beside organized equipment parts, hinting at an army meant to become professional and predictable. Alexander had tried to turn loyalty into procedure, rank structures, rotations, audited salaries, but now every soldier watched to see which commander could guarantee coin. In an inspection office, measuring cords and seal stones sat beside maps of routes and depots. Audits and rotations were supposed to prevent satraps from becoming kings. But oversight requires a center that can punish disobedience consistently. When punishment becomes uncertain, independence grows. In a maritime strategy hall, an anonymous outline of Arabia spread across a table with ship models and water jar markers. Alexander's plan was not simply to conquer coasts, but to secure sea lanes through stations, treaties, and logistics. Death had frozen the moment before exploration could become administration. In a standards chamber, scales and weights formed perfect lines like a promise of fairness. Alexander pushed economic unity to make tax and trade predictable. But predictability depends on enforcement. Without consistent inspectors and consequences, standards become suggestions and corruption becomes policy. In an atelier of canals and port basins, engineers studied hydrology models pinned by stones. Infrastructure was meant to bind provinces into one machine, rivers feeding warehouses, warehouses feeding ports, ports feeding fleets. Yet funding and labor drift quickly when rulers argue over who is legitimate. In a city charter registry, templates of gates and courtyards sat beside a network of planned foundations. Alexander founded cities as anchors, but a city becomes an anchor only when its charter is protected, its court staffed, its grain secured, and its taxes regulated beyond a founder's lifetime. In a precedent room, unmarked bundles of rulings waited to be organized into consistent law. Alexander had expanded into many legal worlds. The unfinished task was to build a shared procedure strong enough that justice did not depend on local power or military threat. In a relay station, couriers stood by packet racks and tethered horses. Ready but unused, communication was supposed to be automatic, disciplined, and funded, yet discipline fades when no one can guarantee reward or punishment across distance. In a ritual hall, priests and officials arranged calendars and offerings to stabilize loyalty through shared symbols. Alexander understood that legitimacy could be cultivated, but cultivation requires time and consistent protection, not a single dramatic gesture. At a border office, rosters and pay chests sat beside maps of passes and watchtowers. The frontier was meant to be permanent, defended by audited provisioning and rotation schedules. But permanent defenses fail when armies become the private instruments of rival claimants. In a regency chamber, a diadem under cloth and unmarked rings sat like bait. Paperwork and symbols became weapons because the succession had not been made transparent and enforceable. The empire's center was turning into a contest of access. And in the throne hall tableau, the lines on the map no longer converged on one point. Alexander's unfinished work was visible everywhere. The empire could not yet run itself. It still needed him to make every routine real. And without him, routine became negotiation, and negotiation became war. In the codification chamber of Babylon, judges and scribes gathered beneath a silent hierarchy of appeals, surrounded by blank tablets and sealed clay. The dream was clear, one consistent legal procedure across many cultures. But without a stable center, law becomes a language spoken differently in every province, and consistency dissolves into convenience. In a succession protocol room, unmarked signet rings lay beside sealed packets and blank ledgers like a court case without a verdict. Councils, regencies, chains of command, all were sketched as structure, yet none could compel obedience if rivals did not agree the structure was real. The missing step was not design, it was enforceable acceptance. Along the riverbank, engineers returned to canal models, counting bricks and labor quotas with calibrated containers and standardized weights. Flood control, dredging, irrigation, these were the quiet tasks that keep empires fed. Alexander's conquest expanded faster than maintenance could become routine. And routine is what keeps a river from turning into a disaster. In a naval academy courtyard, racks of oars and sailcloth sat beside pay chests and training schedules. Alexander wanted a sea force that could function like clockwork, with disciplined crews and audited provisioning. But when leadership fractures, training becomes faction, and ships become tools for whoever pays first. In a westward expedition staging chamber, coastlines and island silhouettes spread across an unnamed chart. Weighed down by stones, ship miniatures marked convoy routes, while diplomats prepared gifts for treaties that would have replaced war with administration. Yet every outward plan required inward stability, and stability was the one conquest Alexander had not finished. In a coastal reconnaissance bureau, pilots and geographers arranged instruments for long-range surveys of unknown shores. The goal was to convert the unfamiliar into routine stations with supplies, rules, and inspections. Alexander died before exploration could harden into an institution, leaving horizons as promises rather than policy. At a market gatehouse, inspectors aligned weights and measures as if fairness could be engineered by precision. Merchants waited with amphorae and cloth bales, hoping for predictable tolls. Alexander began standardization, but uniform enforcement demands years of inspections. penalties, and public trust that cannot be rushed. In a census archive, administrators prepared ledgers to register land, labor, and production so taxation could become planning instead of predation. Citizens waited with baskets and tools, sensing that being counted can be either protection or threat. Without a stable state, records become leverage, not fairness. Inside a military depot, equipment parts lay in organized lanes, hinting at a professional army where promotions and pay followed procedure. Alexander pushed integration and discipline to prevent private factions. But private factions return when salaries are delayed and chains of command are disputed. In a desert relay headquarters, packet racks stood in strict rows and horses waited tethered, ready to carry orders across distance. Communication was meant to be automatic, funded, and disciplined, yet discipline collapses when no single authority can guarantee consequences. In a translation and copying bureau, scribes prepared bilingual decrees and standardized reports so governance could move across languages without distortion. But even perfect translation fails when the decree is no longer unquestioned, and records can be seized by the strongest claimant. In an integration council hall, Macedonian companions and Persian nobles stood separated by an invisible fault line. Shared seating diagrams and ceremonial objects implied unity by habit, not fear. Habit requires consistency, and consistency requires a future that is not contested. In a memorial atelier, a monumental funerary model promised a tomb that could anchor legitimacy. Yet a tomb can also become a contested symbol, and even a ruler's remains can be turned into a weapon if succession is not settled. At a border-ridge command post, maps of passes and watchtowers lay beside pay chests and supply crates. The frontier was supposed to be defended by routine, audited provisioning. Rotations, lawful command, but when the center fractures, every frontier commander becomes a potential king. And in the final tableau of the throne hall, an empty chair faced a network of ports, depots, garrisons, and courts drawn as dots and lines. The machinery of empire still existed, but it was not yet self-sustaining. Alexander's unfinished work was not another battle. It was the permanent institutions that would have made every battle unnecessary after he died. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more content like this. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. In a Babylon council hall devoted to water management, a basin and canal model sat like a silent warning. Rivers do not respect politics, and irrigation does not wait for succession disputes. Alexander's administrators knew that without routine dredging, flood control, and enforced water rights, harvests would fail, and famine would turn politics into violence. In a sanitation planning chamber near crowded streets, bowls, linens, and drainage samples hinted at something rare for ancient empires: civic stability built through public order. Not only through soldiers, disease spreads where governance is inconsistent, and Alexander died before hygiene enforcement and protected funding could become an ordinary habit across cities. In an oath registry hall, commanders from different regions stood around signet rings and rosters meant to record loyalty as a legal fact. Alexander needed obedience that could be audited, renewed, and enforced by procedure, but oaths are weak when the reward system is uncertain and punishments depend on rival claimants. In an army demobilization office, veterans faced administrators over land grids and sealed packets that promised property, rations, and legal protection. Turning soldiers into citizens required steady delivery, predictable courts, and protected rights. Without those, veterans become unemployed armies, and unemployment becomes a new kind of war. In a port law chamber, harbor plans and toll instruments were arranged to create predictable docking rights and audited manifests. Alexander wanted the sea governed by routine administration so trade could stabilize the empire's wealth. Yet without consistent patrol schedules and impartial customs enforcement, ports become private treasuries for whoever holds them. In a road and bridge maintenance headquarters, stone blocks and iron fittings waited beside inspection schedules. Roads are not glamorous, but they decide whether orders arrive, grain moves, and armies stay loyal. Maintenance requires steady funding, and steady funding collapses first when legitimacy is disputed. In a calendar standard chamber, scholars measured time as if it were a kind of power. A shared schedule could unify planting seasons, tax dates, and provisioning cycles. But imposing time requires trust. And trust erodes when rulers argue over who is real. In a language policy bureau, scribes prepared standardized decrees in multiple tongues so governance could cross cultures without confusion. Yet the more paper multiplies, the more paper must be protected. Alexander died before copying, cataloging, and distribution could become so routine that records could not be captured. In a temple protection charter hall, officials planned budgets and legal limits to keep sanctuaries safe from confiscation and harassment. Alexander used religious respect as diplomacy, but diplomacy becomes fragile if successors can bargain away protections to reward allies. In an anti-corruption inspection office, scales and ledgers waited like instruments of justice. Alexander knew that corruption grows in distance and ambiguity. The unfinished work was not discovering fraud, but building an oversight system strong enough to punish it consistently without becoming predation itself. At a federated defense pavilion on the frontier, supply crates and pay chests sat beside maps of watchtowers. A permanent defense line needs audited provisioning, stable rotations, and lawful command chains. Without those, frontier garrisons become private armies that answer to the nearest treasure, not the distant ideal. In a city network registry, models of civic gates and harbor basins implied a blueprint for repeatable stability. Alexander founded cities as anchors, yet anchors require protected charters, staffed courts, and grain policies that do not change with every new claimant. In a mausoleum funding chamber, a monumental funerary model reminded everyone that memory can be weaponized. A tomb can unify, but it can also become a prize. And even a ruler's remains can be moved, hidden, or displayed to claim legitimacy. And in the partition hall where rivals faced an unlabeled empire map, the lesson became visible. Unity was not guaranteed by geography. It was guaranteed by institutions, courts, audits, standards, roads, ports, relays, that ran without the founder. Alexander's greatest unfinished task was making those systems self-sustaining before the empire turned into inheritance. In the river cities of Mesopotamia, the first signs of fracture were never dramatic. They were small delays, a dredging crew not paid, a bridge repair postponed, a grain inspection skipped. Alexander's planners had tried to turn maintenance into law, but law weakens when no one can prove who speaks for the center. In the marketplaces, merchants watched the scales with a new kind of caution. Standard weights were still aligned, but everyone knew standards only matter when inspectors are fearless and penalties are real. Once punishment becomes negotiable, fraud becomes normal. At the customs gates, harbor clerks held blank manifests and seal stones, waiting to learn whose seal would count tomorrow. Alexander's dream of predictable tolls and audited docking rights depended on one thing: continuity. Without continuity, the port becomes a private treasury. In the shipyards, timber stacks sat untouched while hull frames aged in place. Crews can be trained, ships can be built, but naval discipline requires a long chain of routine, pay, rations, patrol schedules, and courts-martial that do not change with politics. That chain was not yet unbreakable. In diplomatic halls, envoys stood beside unmarked gifts and sealed packets, trying to secure peace through treaties rather than war. Yet treaties are only paper if enforcement is uncertain, and uncertainty invited every rival to renegotiate every promise. In the courthouse rooms, precedent bundles waited to be organized into consistent procedure. Alexander had entered many legal worlds and tried to unify them, but when the center weakens, local power returns as the true judge, and the law becomes whatever the strongest man can make it. In the archive workshops, scribes copied reports meant to travel the empire's corridors like blood. Alexander understood that records are governance, but records are also targets, and without protected distribution, memory becomes spoil. In the relay stations, horses stood ready while packet racks stayed full. Communication is not a miracle, it is discipline, maintenance, and consequences. When those consequences vanish, distance returns, and distance breeds independent rulers. In the education chambers, young heirs and hostages learned procedures and languages meant to bind him to one imperial center. The project required years of predictable careers and protected rights. Without a stable succession, even education becomes a hostage to politics. In the integration halls, elites from different cultures faced one another with polite stillness masking fear. Alexander tried to replace suspicion with habit through appointments and shared institutions. Habit, however, cannot be created in a moment, it needs time. And time ran out. In the veterans' settlements, land grids and ration promises sat beside half-built walls. Demobilization was meant to create citizens. But when supplies are delayed and courts are weak, veterans remember the only structure that never failed them, the army. At the frontier, watchtowers looked over silent passes while officers counted pay chests and ration crates. A defense line becomes permanent only when salaries arrive and rotations are enforced. Without that, frontier troops become negotiable force, sold to the highest claimant. In the treasury halls, auditors weighed coin blanks and tribute containers of mismatched sizes. Alexander began to unify measures and currency, but enforcement could not be rushed. The moment the center wavered, local systems reappeared like weeds in abandoned stone. In the sanitation and water offices, planners understood a brutal truth: disease and flood do not wait for politics to settle. The empire needed routine civic order, not heroic improvisation. Routine is exactly what succession crisis destroys first. In the temple protection halls, officials tried to shield sanctuaries with charters and budgets. Alexander used religious respect to stabilize rule, but protections become bargaining chips when new rulers need allies. In the grand map rooms where the empire was drawn as dots and lines, everyone saw the same thing: the machinery still existed. The roads, ports, courts, depots, and garrisons were all there, but the switch that made them one system was missing. And that missing switch was the unfinished work Alexander never completed, a transfer of power so clear and institutional that the empire could continue as a routine, without his presence, rather than shattering into a war over who gets to claim his silence. In Babylon, the city that held the empire's nerve center, silence became the most dangerous rumor. When Alexander's authority faded, every delay felt like a message, and every message felt like a threat. In the regency rooms, men studied each other's hands more than their faces, watching where signet rings rested and who stood closest to the sealed packets. The succession was not a single question, but a chain of questions: who commands the army? Who controls the treasury? Who speaks for the law? Who answers the provinces? In a chamber of audits and scales, officials tried to keep the state honest by measuring everything. Yet honesty requires a single standard of punishment, and punishment requires one uncontested center. Without it, inspectors become bribe takers or martyrs, and the ledger becomes a weapon. In the grain halls, rations were meant to flow like predictable seasons. But the moment provinces suspected the center might not protect them, they started protecting themselves, hoarding grain, delaying shipments, bargaining for exemptions. Food became politics, and politics became hunger. In the courts, judges understood that precedent is only as strong as enforcement. Alexander's unfinished legal unification left too much room for local power to reassert itself. When a governor can ignore a ruling without consequence, the law stops being law. In the road and relay stations, the empire's arteries waited for orders that could no longer be guaranteed. Horses stood tethered, satchels ready, packets sealed. But if the destination cannot compel obedience, the message is only paper traveling toward uncertainty. In the shipyards, naval officers stared at hull frames like skeletons of ambition. Alexander's maritime plans required steady payroll, disciplined training, and protected shipyards. With succession contested, shipyards turned into prizes, and fleets turned into bargaining chips. In diplomatic halls by the sea, envoys prepared gifts for treaties that might never be signed. Alexander had imagined replacing endless campaigning with stable agreements and administered ports. But agreements dissolve when rivals believe they can win more through force. In the standards chambers, weights and measures were aligned with almost religious care. Alexander pushed unity of trade to stabilize the empire's wealth. Yet unity requires that every market, every port, every tax office fears the same consequences for cheating. Now consequences depended on which claimant you served. In the cultural integration halls, mixed elites stood in lines that looked formal but felt like trenches. Alexander had tried to replace ethnic division with shared careers and shared institutions. But institutions cannot be shared when the top of the pyramid is missing. In the education chambers, young nobles learned languages and procedures meant to bind them to a central state. The program needed years to become habit. turning ambition into service. But ambition is impatient, and impatience grows when succession is unclear. In the archive rooms, scribes tried to protect memory, copies, catalogs, distribution routes, so that governance could survive change. Yet when power fractures, archives become loot, and whoever controls records controls the story of legitimacy. In sanitation and water offices, planners faced a cruel schedule. Floods and disease do not negotiate. Alexander's civic stability projects required protected funding and consistent enforcement. Crisis makes consistency impossible, and inconsistency invites catastrophe. On the frontier, commanders weighed pay chests against loyalty. Alexander had tried to make rotations and salaries routine. Now routine became persuasion, and persuasion became bribery, and bribery became civil war. In the final tableau of the empty chair, the empire's systems looked complete: ports, depots, courts, roads, granaries. Yet they were not a machine, they were parts. Alexander's unfinished work was the mechanism that forces parts to function together when the founder is gone. And as the city held its breath, everyone understood, conquest had built a world, but only institutions could keep it from breaking. That was the one thing Alexander did not finish before death made every promise negotiable. In the last days, the empire did not fall with a single blow. It frayed, thread by thread, wherever authority depended on habit and habit depended on a living king. In the councils, the organizational charts looked elegant, but they were still promises. Councils and chains of command only become real when men believe obedience is safer than disobedience. And that belief required the one thing Alexander could not leave unfinished: a clear, enforceable transfer of power. In the corridors of the palace, locked doors multiplied, and with them suspicion. Control of access became control of decisions, and control of decisions became control of the empire. The seal, once a tool, turned into a crown. In the treasuries, coin and tribute were no longer neutral resources. They became leverage. Whoever could pay the soldiers could claim legitimacy, and whoever could claim legitimacy could demand more resources. It was a loop Alexander had tried to break by building procedure. But the procedure was not yet hardened. In the army camps, discipline began to compete with loyalty. Alexander had forged an army that could march across continents, but he had not finished turning that army into a permanent institution immune to personal bribery. Without routine pay and enforceable rotation, troops listened to the voice closest to the chest of silver. In the provinces, satraps watched the silence from Babylon and learned how far they could push. Oversight tours, audits, and rotations had been designed to prevent local dynasties. Now every delay felt like permission, and every province became a negotiation. In the Greek cities, politics returned like a tide that had only been held back, not transformed. Alliances and councils began recalculating their futures. Because legitimacy from the center no longer felt inevitable, rebellion does not always start with violence, it starts with paperwork and confidence. At the ports, naval plans and trade policies became fragile. Alexander's maritime vision required stable customs law, disciplined shipyards, and consistent patrols. The moment succession turned uncertain, the sea became a stage for rival treasuries and rival flags. In the courts, legal unification revealed its weakness. Precedent needs enforcement. Enforcement needs stable authority. Without it, judges become regional servants, and justice becomes a word shaped by whoever holds the garrison. In the archives, scribes understood they were protecting more than scrolls. They were protecting continuity itself. But continuity cannot be protected by storage alone. It requires a distribution network, trusted seals, and penalties for tampering, systems that were still too vulnerable. In the road relays, couriers waited for orders that could not be guaranteed. Alexander's empire was connected by movement, messages, grain, coin, soldiers. Once movement slowed, distance grew, and distance is the birthplace of separate kingdoms. In the granaries, the first hoarded sack changed the entire political climate. Food was meant to be governed by audited distribution. Now food became a bargaining chip, and bargaining chips create winners and losers who are willing to fight. In the settlement offices, veterans watched land grants and ration promises wobble. Alexander wanted demobilization to become peace. But peace requires reliable courts and reliable supply, and both weaken when the center becomes contested. In the temples, protections that were meant to stabilize loyalty became tools for alliance building. Alexander had tried to make religious respect a policy. Now it became a favor traded for support. In the water and sanitation plans, the most sobering truth remained: natural pressures never pause. Flood, drought, disease, these forces expose weak administration faster than any enemy. Alexander's projects needed decades of maintenance, not months of enthusiasm. In the empty throne hall, the empire was still drawn as a network: ports, depots, garrisons, courts, roads, but the network needed a mechanism to keep running. Alexander's unfinished work was the transformation of his personal will into an institution that could say no to every rival at once. And that is why, when he died, the greatest uncompleted conquest was not western seas or Arabian coasts. It was succession itself, the final bridge between a world built by one man and a world that could survive without him. When the empire finally understood that Alexander would not rise again, it faced a test more brutal than any battlefield. Could the system breathe without the man who had been its lungs? In the palace, the regency circles tightened around seals, packets, and access points. The succession question, left incomplete, turned every routine into a contest: appointments, payroll, legal judgments, even who could enter which corridor. Alexander had planned structures, but structures without accepted authority become arenas. In the treasuries, coin became prophecy. Pay chests were no longer a tool for stability, they were invitations to mutiny or loyalty. Depending on who held the key, Alexander's unfinished work was turning finance into audited routines so that money served the state, not the next strongest claimant. In the granaries, ration control threatened to collapse into hoarding and seizure. Food was supposed to move by ledgers and inspections, not by fear, but fear spreads faster than paperwork, and fear is what fills the vacuum when succession is unclear. In the courts, precedent waited to become law, and law waited to become habit. Alexander had dreamed of consistent procedure across cultures, a justice strong enough to outlast conquest. Yet enforcement depends on an uncontested center, and the center was dissolving into rival claims. On the roads and at relay stations, packets piled up like unanswered questions. Communication was meant to be automatic, disciplined, funded, and punished when neglected. When consequences vanish, distance returns, and distance breaks empires into regions that stop listening. At the ports and shipyards, maritime ambition turned fragile. Alexander's fleets required trained crews, stable customs law, and predictable patrol schedules. Without continuity, shipyards became prizes and ships became bargaining chips, not instruments of a common policy. In the provinces, audits and rotations stalled. The inspection tours that would have prevented satraps from becoming kings depended on routine authority. Without it, local power expanded quietly, one exemption, one delayed shipment, one ignored order at a time. In the education and integration programs, the future generation became uncertain. Alexander had tried to bind elites through shared careers, shared institutions, shared legitimacy, but shared legitimacy cannot be taught if the top of the hierarchy is disputed. In the archives, memory became vulnerable. Records can unify an empire only when copying, cataloging, and distribution are protected by law and consequences. When power fractures, archives become loot, and whoever controls records controls the story of legitimacy. In the water, sanitation, and infrastructure plans, the empire confronted the cold truth of administration. Floods, drought, disease, and decay do not negotiate. Alexander's vision required decades of maintenance enforced by habit. Succession crisis destroys habit first. On the frontier, loyalty became coin and fear again. A permanent defense line needed audited provisioning, stable rotations, and lawful command chains. Without those, frontier troops became negotiable force. And negotiable force is the seed of civil war. In the veterans' settlements, promises trembled. Demobilization was supposed to be peace built in property lines and court rulings. Without reliable supply and enforcement, veterans remembered the one institution that always paid in certainty, the sword. And in the final image, the empty chair faced an empire of parts: roads, ports, courts, granaries, relays, garrisons, each capable, each necessary, none sufficient alone. Alexander's last unfinished conquest was not another coastline or another city. It was making those parts a self-sustaining system that could say, with authority, the empire continues, even when the founder is gone. He died before that mechanism became unbreakable, and because it was unfinished, unity became negotiable, negotiability became rivalry, and rivalry became the inheritance that followed his silence. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more content like this. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think.